Welcome to Future You. This is a forum on neoliberalism and public higher education. With me is my colleague Frank Fear. We are both Professor Emerita over at Michigan State University. This forum stems from a conference that we had back in 2015 here at Michigan State University. And since then, we have been online having these forums. We typically invite our colleagues, former presidents, students, and others who are engaged in examining and critiquing the impact of neoliberalism on higher education. Today, we have three stellar scholars. We are very, very pleased to have them with us. They're going to be speaking on campus protests and providing faculty perspectives. With us are Bethany Latique. She is at George Mason University. Also with us is Jennifer Ruth. She is at Portland State University. Both of these colleagues have been with us in the past. And also with us is Noelle McAfee. She is over at Emory University. I am going to provide a more detailed description of their achievements when each one is going to speak, and we will get started with Bethany. This is a very, very important topic. It raises issues of academic freedom, student academic freedom in particular. It raises issues of free expression, and it raises issues about the role of the university in our society and the role of students as the conscience of our society in times of tremendous polarization and political challenges and so on. We're going to go ahead and get started first with Bethany Latique. She is a professor at the College of Education and Human Development at George Mason University, and she is going to be speaking on the coordinated attack that has been taking place across the country on higher education. Each of our guests today is a highly published scholar, so I'm not going to be able to go into all of the publications that that they have out there for us. Simply to say that Bethany specializes in community-based participatory action research. She describes herself as a methodologist and works with marginalized families, including immigrant families. And she is going to be speaking on the coordinated attack. So I will now turn it over to Bethany.
Okay, so what I wanted to talk about is not just the protests and the protests that took place across the Commonwealth of Virginia, but also to put this moment into a broader context, a context that recognizes that we are under attack in higher education and that this is a coordinated assault by many different entities. It's important to recognize that this assault on higher education and academic repression has a deep and long history. I recommend the Imperial University as just one of many scholarly reads where many academics are sharing their stories of academic repression. Want to recognize that undue political and wealthy donor interference in higher education have been going on for a long time. You may be familiar with the story of George Mason University, and in particular, the undue donor involvement of the Charles Koch Foundation, and that these have been issues brewing for quite some time. However, in September of 2023, there was a Palestinian literature festival that raised the concerns or ire of wealthy donors at UPenn, and these donors put great pressure on the administration to cancel the event. And I focus here because some of my colleagues were involved in this festival, and I want to just recognize that this repression and you know, repression of free speech and academic freedom was brewing prior to October 7th and the subsequent war in Gaza. In November of 2023, there were a group of us, including Jennifer Ruth, who we all got together at Drexel Law Review to focus on discussions of academic freedom and the ongoing repression. And all of this was leading up to scholars coming together, calling for a national day of action in higher education for the public good. We had more than 100 campuses sign up to participate in this event. And I share this because on the same day, April 17th, was the day that the students' encampment began at Columbia University, triggering the nationwide protest. We want to show that this was no historical accident, that these movements are motivated by the same concerns about the future of higher education, both in the United States and around the world. And I just have lots of pictures and visuals, but of course, protests, we saw them pop up across the country, while also UN experts and others began raising alarms about scholasticide in Gaza, and again, the same in academic repression in the United States. Now, in Virginia, we had 4 campuses build encampments. Youngkin, our governor, suggested that he would only support peaceful protests. However, we saw across the country what happened when peaceful protests were met with violent police responses, and you know, there were students at UVA who confronted President Jim Ryan at the time, demanding answers for a state police crackdown on protesters who, up until that point, the protests had been very peaceful. And I want to juxtapose this at UVA specifically. So you might remember in 2017, there was the Unite the Right rally, a rally of white supremacists who came to Charlottesville. And of course, the clashes over white nationalism led to violence and death. The Unite the Right protests resulted in 4 arrests of individuals. The 4 Virginia universities who engaged in encampment and protests over the war in Gaza led to 125 arrests. That's just, I think, a stark indication of the university's response to protests in the current moment. And one of my colleagues who helped to organize the National Day of Action wrote this: as students and faculty across the country hold their ground to stand in solidarity with Palestine and face intense repression from administrations, police, and politicians for doing so, we recognize our shared struggles are not about one day. They are about the ongoing and interconnected battles we face together. And I want to go out from these protests to really put this in the frame of Isaac Kamola's work, where he talks about manufacturing backlash and the right-wing think tanks and legislative attacks on higher education. We have to recognize that they're all incredibly interlinked. And when I share this to you, and I'll talk about this in a moment, but it's really motivating a movement, a solidarity movement that recognizes these interconnections. You may be familiar with the Chris Rufo character. He is given credit for inventing the conflict over critical race theory. But more recently, he wrote about the need for conservatives to create a strong association, not just around anti-CRT, but between Hamas, Black Lives Matter, DSA, and academic decolonization in the public mind. He said, we must connect the dots, then attack, delegitimize, and discredit, make the center left disavow them, make them political untouchables. So there's clearly this national coordinated attack going on. And I want to point out a couple of resources that you might be interested in that connect to the anti-CRT work of the right, anti-DEI, and the like. Last week at the AAUP National Conference, we heard from a group around CRT Forward. This is a UCLA School of Law critical race studies program that is looking at the anti-CRT bills across the country and showing that the number of anti-CRT measures introduced has increased since 2020. CRT Forward is documenting the rise of these bills. And Taifa Alexander, who's the project director, while speaking at AUP, really brought into frame the false equivalence where you see anti-racism being equated with racism and anti-Zionism being equated with anti-Semitism. And we must understand the tactics fomented by Chris Rufo, but the tactics on the right to create the narratives that are allowing for academic freedom repression and other movements to weaken the position of higher education, and particularly public higher education in America. The other thing that the other story I want to bring into focus here beyond the protest is also the connection to Project 2025. Lindsay Burke of the Heritage Foundation is one of the authors of one of the chapters in Project 2025, focusing on public education. And some have suggested that the goal is to end public education as we know it, particularly if Trump is elected president. I bring Lindsay into frame because not only is she at the Heritage Foundation, not only is she an author of Project 2025, but she's also a board member at George Mason University. And last year, we started to see the Heritage Foundation staffers of Lindsay Burke, Jay Green, and Mike Gonzalez writing about DEI at Virginia's public universities and their concern over DEI bloat. And then the governor and the board requested syllabi from both George Mason University and Virginia, and VCU. And although faculty pushed really hard to fight back against the governor's interference with our curriculum and the board's interference with our curriculum, at the end of the year, in May of 2024, both our universities pulled the courses that were claimed to be courses that were going to indoctrinate students around diversity, equity, and inclusion matters. And so we lost that battle over curriculum control at two of our public institutions of higher education. Should be very concerning to folks, all of these things that we're confronting at the same time. Ellen Schrecker has written very profoundly about political repression and focusing on the AAUP and our tactics. And I've highlighted here, in thinking, and I'm a part of the AAUP and with the American Association of University Professors, and we are working in concert to fight back against these various assaults on higher ed. But Ellen is clear that the AUP's traditional response of investigating individual cases and developing policies to implement its 1915 and 1940 principles will not save the academic profession. And so I want to just conclude my remarks by focusing on the kinds of activism and movement building that are taking place at this moment to push back against this attack on higher education, recognizing that our struggles are linked and so are our futures. So there was a group of us, and Jennifer Ruth is also a part of this work, but we got together as faculty and we started planning the April 17th Day of Action. And I just want to recognize that these were some of the key members of the steering committee that pulled together the organizing and the planning for this day. And it's also important to recognize this was not just an AUP event, but it was a big tent effort to bring in labor and organizing and faculty from across the country to join this day of action. We declared what we stood for: democracy, the freedom to teach and learn, to stand for the democratic value of dissent, for higher education for all, for job security, and for democracy. And we call on all members of higher education across the country to engage in collective action for higher ed in the public interest. We stand in solidarity with all who are organizing unions, AUP chapters, and student organizations to win the conditions that make teaching, learning, and research possible. For the National Day, we had a press conference, National Teach-In, and you can go to the website if you just Google National Day of Action for Higher Education, and you can watch these excellent presentations from a variety of experts speaking on attacks on DEI, on student debt, on adjunctification, on other, issues around academic freedom, et cetera, recognizing how all of these things are interlinked. Here are just some photos of our colleagues engaged in action across the country. There were some press highlights that are also featured on that website. And so I just want to conclude both by thanking my colleagues who were so involved in this effort, and just to thank you all for the opportunity to be here today and to talk about some of this stuff. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from my other colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethany, and thank you very much for the work that you have been doing to ensure that the Academy is not taken down by the regressive forces in society. This is not the first time that the Academy has been under attack, but it seems to be one of the most widespread movements that we are facing today. Next is our colleague, Jennifer Ruth. As I mentioned, she has been with us before. She was actually with us with her colleague, Ellen Schrecker. And we are delighted that they have, with their colleague, Dr. Johnson, they've also just recently come out with an edited book on the right to learn, resisting the right-wing attack on academic freedom. So with that, let me then turn to Jennifer Ruth, who is going to be speaking on her own activities over at Portland State. She is with film studies over there, and is also an associate dean and so on. So we're looking forward to hearing about the activities that have taken place over at Portland State. Jennifer?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Bethany, for that postcard. Lots to say. Oh, the first thing I want to say is I put my Gmail in the chat. because I'm on the steering committee for this next coming National Day of Action. So if people got interested in what Bethany had to say about that day, April 17th, and the speakers and the website, feel free to email me about upcoming planning for what's going to happen this coming year. So I really want to thank Bethany for emphasizing a couple of things: the importance of linked struggles and collective action, and the fact that we are in a new moment because I've also, like Bethany, have been very involved over the years, when I first I've been at Portland State. So I'm in the Pacific Northwest, unlike Noelle and Bethany. And I've been at Portland State since I was 29, just finished my PhD. I instantly got on the PSU AAUP Executive Council and have been involved in the AAUP both nationally and locally off and on my whole career. But it's true that this is a new moment that requires not just reports, and it also doesn't require more think pieces. This isn't, I mean, and that's something I'm sort of, I like to write these sort of op-eds about this kind of stuff, but that doesn't make a dent. It's going to take organization. It's going to take faculty, staff, and students organizing together. And we're not going to think our way out of this. And that's I think a typical sort of trap for intellectuals around this. Like, yeah, we have smarter arguments. Yeah, we can see the hypocrisy. Yeah, we can see all of these things. We can expose, I think the best way to sort of indicate or sort of highlight the fact that we're not going to think our way out of it or expose the hypocrisy as a way out of it is the Bethany showed us that, I think it was a tweet, right, by Ruffo about here's how we do it with the Palestinian solidarity stuff. This is how, and so back when he was back in the earlier moments of this right-wing attack on higher education to delegitimize higher education that has swept within it, of course, the October 7th stuff in the pro-Palestinian and trying to link it all. Back then, he, tweeted about doing the same thing to critical race theory. It's a very famous quote now where he said, we're going to empty it of what it means, and we're going to fill it with all this garbage that white people are scared of. People, there's a moment where it's like, we got him. Look, he said, this is just a branding exercise. This isn't actually meaningful. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because there's too many forces that are working, that are coordinated, and that are also have their own various agendas, but these various agendas are aligning and in the sort of confluence of things. And so it's going to take some real solidarity across ranks, across groups on campuses. And I think it might well take sort of nationwide strikes, nationwide struggles. And unfortunately, so far, and I do think I have an interesting position on this as an associate dean, although as I was mentioning before, my particular associate dean position just buys me out of 2 courses. So I'm also still in the classroom, and it gives me an interesting kind of place to be part of to some extent, not hugely part of conversations with administration, and otherwise still very faculty identified. And the thing that worries me is that the writing on the wall for the last few years is that administrators are going the compliance route, and compliance now means complicity. It just does. So if you're in, Tennessee and you are getting rid of your DEI offices, you're letting partisan politicians dictate what your institution is doing. So you're going along with the complete destruction of institutional autonomy. If you are right now in DEI offices or presidents of universities and you're watching the December 5th hearings, the congressional hearings, and you're saying, we really need to mandate anti-Semitism trainings and we need to crack down on all the scourge of anti-Semitism, you are also showing that you're complying in a complicit kind of way with the suppression of political speech and academic freedom. So it's at the national level. And what's sort of incredibly shocking about this moment from someone who's been interested in higher ed issues since, for the last 25 years, is the degree to which the reverberations at the national level, the national level reverberates through all universities. So one of the sort of talking points of the right wing is the idea that, the part of delegitimizing higher ed is to connect it to global elites and the people the sort of politically correct, etc., the people, the snobs who look down on the MAGA people. And so going after Columbia, Harvard, and MIT as the first was important. And if I sort of keep an eye on certain kinds of podcasts and certain kinds of websites to see how these narratives are developing. And one of the narratives, of course, is that these Columbia, Harvard students, Hunter, all these students, they're really just cosplaying, right, as Hamas terrorists. And they also are doing it out of their liberal white guilt, rich guilt, because these are elite students. But my point is that what's happening at the national level is not just Columbia, Harvard, MIT. Portland State is not an elite institution. It's, U of O is the flagship, Oregon State, and then there's Portland State. And we're tended to be a commuter school. We tended, back in the day when there was state subsidies and federal subsidies for state institutions, we were very cheap. Of course, tuition's been outsourced and privatized. So, and we're seeing the same things. And our president, just like everywhere else, is just as scared by the congressional hearings. It doesn't matter what institution you're at, private, public, low rank, high rank, elite, what institution you're at, administrators are watching this and they're thinking about their jobs. They're not thinking about how the line for the integrity of higher education is being crossed increasingly, and that the moment to sort of stand up was the anti-CRT moment, actually, and they didn't. And now they're also complying with this. And if Trump is elected and we have Project 2025, the compliance is the rift between the administrative level and the national partisan politics that's taking over is going to create a rift between those groups and faculty, staff, students. And we're gonna see a lot more collective action. This is to not minimize the moral impulse of these protests around Gaza, and to not minimize how the genocide in Gaza. I don't minimize it when I say that there's a way in which this could be a dress rehearsal for things, for more turmoil, more protests, more collective action going forward, particularly if Trump is elected. Although right now we have bipartisan repression. The Palestine exception to academic freedom and free speech is alive and very well, and being, and escalating. These resolutions that say that Bethany pointed to the person from the CRT Forward who said it's very important to understand anti-racism does not equal racism, although that's the narrative equivalence that they're trying to draw. Anti-Zionism does not equal anti-Semitism. And so to the extent that we buy that narrative that came originally from the far right and has now been mainstreamed, and it's been mainstreamed in part because of the Koch libertarian and the sort of anxiety around snowflakes. That's how it started, right? The snowflake students. So it's now been mainstreamed, but to the extent that we go along with that, and administrators are increasingly going along with it and not even registering privately that this is BS, which they used to do, we are going along with the kind of repression that is fascistic, in the sense that, with Trump, if you're going to be part of Trump's coterie, you have to go along with the big lie about the stolen election. We're now all sort of being pressed at the pain of revoked job offers for graduate students, at the pain of sanctions, and, if they remove tenure, and that's getting removed and weakened in a lot of places, we're all being sort of forced to go along with things that aren't true, that are not true. And it's incredibly disturbing. So let me just try to wrap up with specifics about Portland State, because I think Bethany did such a good job of showing the arc of this. And so maybe some specifics that even at Portland State in the Pacific Northwest, we had students who occupied first of all, we have a particular set of coordinates in that we are downtown, and we have park blocks that would be the natural sort of quads or lawns that, Columbia, where the encampments would be. We have these park blocks, but they actually belong to the city, not to the university. And the university doesn't really have any good, I suppose they could, students might have encamped on the football field, but which is tiny, but we don't really have greens like other universities. So the students started on the park blocks, were told by the Portland Public Police, and we had a shooting death by Portland Public Police of a person on campus a couple of years ago. So police and PSU, we have a very strong disarm PSU movement. So there's a lot of tensions there. But so Portland Public Police told them that they had to move off of the city blocks. So they moved up onto the library steps, which is right in front of the park blocks. It was the natural place to move. It's now to some extent being used. There was some vandalism, there's some graffiti, there was some destruction of property in the library once they occupied the library. And so the fact that is a library has been used to very much demonize the student movement as clueless, ignorant, destroying a sacred space. There's this really sanctimonious kind of rhetoric around these students who are being anti-Semitic and who are destroying sacred, inviolable space of the university. And it latches onto the larger preoccupation with the student protests from the mainstream media that distracts us all from exactly what the students are trying to bring our attention to, which is the genocide in Gaza. And we're all so distracted by that. And there's so many narratives that are distracting us. So the students did that. They're being investigated. The president is a new president who it's her first year. She very much came in thinking that she was going to revitalize Portland. Portland, since the Black Lives Matter stuff, since the legalization of drugs here, Portland State has been seen, Portland has been seen as chaotic and we do have a houselessness epidemic and fentanyl epidemic. So she very much saw her campaign at Portland State to be about making Portland State as a downtown Portland area safe and revitalizing the downtown. So her reaction to these protests and the police was extremely repressive to crack down. And because it's going to undermine, in her mind, it's going to undermine what she's setting out to do in terms of building back the parents' trust in the safety of sending their kids to the Portland State campus, et cetera. So she's cracking down hard. She's also made it clear, and I won't go on too much about this, but everywhere too, the reverberations of this are everywhere, not just at the elite schools. And one of the reverberations of administrators watching the new McCarthyism and the Palestine exception is to say, we need to have task forces so that if we get federally investigated or if we get complaints, we can look like we're actively working on mostly anti-Semitism, but also Islamophobia. Finally, because of usually Palestinian American faculty, the word Palestinian creeps into some of this stuff. But these task forces are happening everywhere, and they're not very coherent, and they're framed around discrimination, which if you're protesting on behalf of Palestinian solidarity, it's not hate, it's the historical injustices and dispossession and the apartheid society. It's not about anti-Semitism. So even the way that it's premised. So all of which is to say that the particular task force here, which I was originally involved in because they wanted an academic freedom person, but I ended up resigning from it because I said from the very beginning, as an academic freedom person, I'm going to be looking at instances of repression, instances of the Palestine exception to academic freedom and free speech. So I'm not going to be looking for Title VI stuff. I'm going to be looking at this. And do you really want me on there, given that? At the time, they said yes. As things progressed, I was at loggerheads with many of them. So I ended up finally resigning so that I could speak out in ways that felt more honest. But so she has made it clear that she's deferring to the Jewish Federation of Portland, which has someone who's very involved in the Jewish Federation, is on our board, was involved in hiring the president, also was a big time donor to PSU. So despite the fact that many Jewish faculty, Jewish Voice for Peace, many Jewish students are right there with the Palestinian protests, despite many people telling her that they do not experience things like from the river to the sea, Palestinians will be free as a call for genocide. She's saying she's going to defer to the victims of hate speech, and she's privileging the ADL kind of, the Anti-Defamation League kind of view on this. So we're looking at a real mess. And I guess the big picture, I'll wrap up now and just say that for me, what's also concerning, not only are we distracted from a genocide and our US complicity, and one of the big issues at Portland State was the fact that we have relationships with Boeing, and the Boeing bombs are being dropped on Rafah, and the students are asking to cut ties. So not only are we being distracted from the genocide, but to some extent, we're being distracted from the larger right-wing forces that Bethany was just talking about that are going to be, coming together for what could be a very existential battle for academic freedom and for political free speech for students and staff. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for those remarks. Really appreciate it. Speaking next is Noelle McAfee. She is the chair of the Department of Philosophy over at Emory, and her areas of emphasis are feminist philosophy, psychoanalysis, and political theory. She also has a lot of secondary affiliations on that campus, many having to do with psychoanalysis. And she was recently arrested over on her campus for stopping by one of the encampments and asking police to stop beating one of the students. So we are delighted that she is with us. She has written in the past on neoliberalism. So welcome, Noelle, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ruben. Thank you, Frank, for inviting me. And I'm delighted to be on here with Bethany and Jennifer. That's a real delight. So let me just start with my arrest at Emory University. Emory University is a Southern, based in Atlanta, kind of has a kind of more of a corporate hierarchical culture. That the faculty, especially in the College of Arts and Sciences, are wonderful. Also at the School of Public Health, just great faculty across. I've also been involved with the AAUP chapter here. So the story gets complicated quickly because a year ago, there were some students who were protesting against Cop City. So if you don't know about Cop City, quickly, it's a very contested a plan to develop a police training facility on the south end of town. And it has, as the Nation has written, you look up the Nation has said, it's amazing. It has ties to the IDF in Israel. It is a way to train the Atlanta Police Department and other police departments who want to come visit about how to use these kind of new tactics of militarized jackbooted thugs, right, to attack, to just police. If you haven't seen this Netflix documentary called Power on the history of the police in the United States since the 1800s, it's a must see. It's very depressing. It's very depressing. We live in a police state. We live in a police state, and many of us don't have to experience that all the time because we're kind of part that the police state is protecting. But for many, this is not the case. Anyway, so a year ago, students decided to camp out on campus to protest Cop City, and they had set up their camps, and then they were planning on spending the night, and then they got warned, like, you can't spend the night here. It's against the rules. And then they brought in the Atlanta Police Department. So the Emory Police Department partners with the APD, and then when the APD came in, they were highly militarized, intimidating, and just petrified the students, and they decamped. So the faculty was appalled by this, and the whole fall was about, why was the APD brought on our campus? Why did that happen? Of course, then after October, after October 7th, there was another anti-Cop City demonstration, and the students started also chanting the pro Gaza, concern for Palestinian statements. And then that day, the president of the university decried the anti-Semitism. So it was this immediate connection of, so now we see that the Cop City, the protests against Cop City are linked in reality and also rhetorically with Palestine. So that goes on, and then, okay, April 25th, the students had organized in advance quietly, and then they come on campus to set up camp. And then that morning, the university sent out a notice that these outside agitators have come to our campus as a private university, and we will not tolerate this, avoid the campus, blah, blah, blah. And so then they, so I went down there at about 10:15 in the morning, thinking, oh, I hope they don't call in the APD again. I mean, please, they wouldn't be that stupid. And I get down and I see a colleague from the AUP, and I said, at least the APD aren't here. And he said, oh, yes, they are. And he points at one end of the quad. They're all massed there. And then we see on the other end of the quad, here comes in a line of the Georgia State Patrol. Like, where, oh, what is that? And then they get to right where we are. Somebody later told me she overheard one cop say to another, the moment your foot hits the grass, attack. And so this lovely little peaceful kumbaya kind of demonstration becomes complete mayhem and violence and beating in just seconds. So I decided to stay in there and video it. And I very purposely kept my foot on the concrete in a neutral posture. And then he asked me to step back, and I said no. And so he arrested me. And so I get dragged off, and some graduate student who I didn't know asked me who I am. And I said, so I happened to look rather composed because it's our day for our annual review, you know, the external review, that once a decade external review. I'm all ready for that. And I'm getting arrested. I have an external review. So anyway, of the 28 people arrested, 23 are affiliated with Emory. So the entire narrative about outside agitators was false, but they kept repeating it, and they used it to basically criminalize the protests. So because they're outside agitators, no one is allowed to go on the quad because it's all these outside people. And now that you're not allowed to go on the quad, if you're there, you're in being disorderly or criminal trespass. And so it was used as a way to do an end run around free expression. We actually have a free expression policy. It's not a great policy, but there's nothing in the policy against pitching a tent on the campus. Nothing. There's no policy against speaking, right? So nothing the students were doing was any way violation, but yeah, I got construed that way. So they happened to arrest, of the 3 faculty members who got arrested, all of us are full professors with tenure. And I'm, of course, I'm the one that has the most spotlight on me. So I've been using that as my job for the past 2 months to basically to raise all these issues. Now, to Jennifer's point that you can't think your way out of this. I'm a philosopher. I try to think my way out of things. But I hear what you're saying. But you're also talking about the importance of strategy, and of course, strategy involves thinking. So my basic approach to all of this, and it's just one tactic among many, is to frame this as an issue of democracy versus authoritarianism. And I don't care what the issue is. The issue happens to be about Gaza and Palestine. As a human being, I am deeply motivated. I am saddened and pained by the actual politics of the. But all of my action has been around not about particulars of this, but about really the rise of the authoritarian university, right? So let me just say a little bit about that. So maybe during the week can bring that in. Let me compare what a non-authoritarian university or college would do. On April 29th, Williams College's president sent out a notice to the community. I'll read you a little bit about what she wrote to the community. Protest encampments on college and university campuses have recently captured national attention. We have reason to believe that some Williams students may be considering a comparable action here. At Williams, we encourage students to use their minds and their voices to develop and express views about the world. This includes a great deal of room for what gets labeled as protest or activism. With that in mind, I want to take a moment to set out the relevant rules and expectations. So she's very specific. She says that there's no rule against an encampment. There are codes of conduct, against drowning out of classrooms or obstructing access or harassing people. But if you modulate your voice and you pitch a tent, it's fine. And the students did that for, I think a few weeks. They had teach-ins, they had they had the educational stuff. The activists were not thrilled with the outcome. They didn't get all of their demands, but the process was good. And I think the key thing here is that the President Maud, I forget her first name, her last name, Maud Bandel. Can she come be my president, please? Her view was that this is a moment of educational moment. This is education, right? Now, I'm among AAUP colleagues. To the documents that are so central to higher education as we know it, that make higher education in the United States was the best, was the Statement on Academic Freedom, and then the 1966 Statement on Shared Governance. And in short, the Shared Governance Statement lays out that that shared governance does not mean that everybody does everything, but that there's kind of joint effort among what they saw the three parts. There is the Board of Trustees, the governing board's part is to look after the integrity of the whole institution. The administration's part is to make sure things run on time, properly. And then there's the faculty part, and the faculty own the curriculum. The faculty's job is education. So what Maud Mandel was doing was recognizing the educational facet of what these students were doing it and let it go. She didn't interfere. Here, in contrast, Emory was one of the two most violent police responses to any of these campus protests around the country. I think the other is the University of Texas. Truly violent. So instead of seeing this as an educational moment, he sees it as it's something that the administrators need to shut down. So let me take a few minutes to close to talk about more specifically the educational mission. I see it as a democratic mission. So in my 2019 book, Fear of Breakdown, little plug there, I lay out 6 democratic practices that happen in any decently functioning democracy, just minimally decent functioning. I compare this to when I was in Greece when I was a teenager, shortly after the junta was deposed. People were there was no democratic space. It was people lived in terror, and it was the absence of people just doing the kinds of things I'll talk about. One is to think of politics as not just what politicians do and governments do, but what we do, what we're doing right now to engage in public matters. 2 is to see oneself as a civic actor, as an agent, who, if there's a problem, you can call a meeting, you can bring people together. The middle 2, I think, are really crucial. The third one is to put items on the agenda. If something is not being addressed, put it on the agenda. That often means protesting, something to get people's attention because it's been neglected. This is what students have done and activists have done for generations. It's an important part of our culture. So, that when Rachel Carson writes about the birds aren't singing anymore, a kind of clarion call, there's something wrong in the environment, or the war in Vietnam, or Black Lives Matter, or my generation, apartheid South Africa. This is what activists do. They are the conscience of our culture. And then once they put them on the agenda, sometimes it's kind of naive. We have demands, answer our demands. But in reality, those get on the agenda, and then in more deliberative spaces, there's ways to address them and work through the complexities, to deliberate, decide what are we willing to do, not willing to do, to get to a point where there's public will to support a direction or not. That's the 4th practice of deliberation. And finally, quickly, the 5th would be to harness that public will for change, like harnessing public will around environmental issues to have farm-to-table movements and things like that, right? And then 6 is to reflect, question, and go back and continue to think this. So my message to wrap this up is that when these students are on the quad, this is not simply it's not just a matter about Gaza, though it is. It's not just a matter about their freedom of expression, though they have it. They are doing a civic role. They're engaged in something vital to democracy. I did an op-ed for Scientific American, and so at the end I say, I don't know if administrators know that, that what they're calling down in shutting down the student activism, they're shutting down democracy. Maybe they do. Maybe that is the aim, is to produce students who will just step away and walk away and be, as talking about, as men be complicit by doing nothing. That kind of loops back into the larger political issues. Maybe, I mean, far right does simply want people to step away and be complicit and shut up. But I think that strategically, and I'd love to hear during our discussion whether you think this has any legs, strategically to pitch this as an issue about civic engagement and democracy versus the authoritarian university would be productive. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Noelle, for those comments. Really appreciate it. I'd like to turn to my colleague Frank Fear at this time, who may make comments or kick off the discussion with some Q&A. So, Frank.
Thank you very much, Ruben. First I have to say thank all three of you. If you had an opportunity to read the bio briefs at our website, Future You, you know that each of the presenters are very distinguished in their respective academic fields. And we all know in higher education how difficult that is to do. It takes persistence, dedication, and then to go beyond and to engage in the way that each of them has, and not just has, but have been doing. And one of the things we've done, and I would encourage you to go to our website to look at the work that we've featured, because we have been featuring their work. I was thinking recently, Jennifer, and I hope I have her surname right, but there was an excellent article written by one of your colleagues from the School of Social Work, Stephanie, is it Wahab?
Wahab, yeah.
Yeah, and written really to the president. I mean, the issues that you were talking about, and we posted that article, and it was an excellent piece in Truthout, so you can find it. And we've been following the work that Bethany has been doing with AAUP recently on a national panel, and so much appreciate the work that she's doing. And it's not only critical work, it is risky work in the sense that you become targeted, and all three have become targeted. And then certainly, Noelle, you mentioned briefly your recent op-ed in Scientific American. We posted that at our site too. And you said something earlier, which I think is really important, that if there is a sort of an upside to, that's not the right word, to being arrested, it gives you a platform. It has put you in the media, and there's a platform for that. And your op-ed really directed at presidents, and your comment about it's an educational moment, I think is really critical. I want to ask one question of each of you, and then we'll open it up. Bethany, one of the things that struck me again deeply in your presentation was the visual citing Christopher Rufo. And what really resonates to me about this is oftentimes we learn about strategy and tactics after the fact. Because I've worked with what I would call academic politicians. And one of the things they always said, Frank, don't let people know what you're trying to do until after you've accomplished it, because they'll try to stop you. Well, Christopher Rufo is not of that ilk. This issue of not only discrediting, but the one line in that graphic, and I'd like to have you respond to it, to see if you believe it has had legs, is the target is not just the conservative or alt-right base. It's really center left to discredit higher education among the center left. If you can get people who otherwise would be strong supporters of higher education to raise questions, to be critical, to criticize, then you're really making progress. The question is, I have my answer to this question. Do you see any evidence of that happening in the general public, of those on the center left?
What a great question. I have so many different thoughts. My answer is yes. My evidence might be disparate, but you know, I guess I want to recognize that you're right. This is a public playbook, as is Project 2025. This is a public playbook of a movement towards authoritarianism. And it's very interesting how that movement has shifted from this, private, secretized sort of takeover of public higher education to now this very public join us in the discrediting of higher education, and the complicitness, as Jennifer was saying, the complacency and the complicitness of huge swaths of people who historically would have been, quote unquote, on our side, have now shifted to self-censorship. And and I don't want to talk about the general public, although I have to say, right, like I do think about this a lot as a parent with children in college, and the enormity of the expense, and how I was the beneficiary of public investment in public higher education. And now we are doling out, hundreds of thousands of dollars to educate our children. Or they're assuming massive debt loads in the trillions of dollars of debt. And yet there is no movement against this. We're all just like, well, that's just the way it goes, I guess, right? And I'm just always shocked that there's no public movement and pushback against the divestment of public higher education. So these movements just it's been like this slow, what is it, like drip, drip, drip of moving us into the current space where there is a silence, self-censorship, complicitness, and a crushing of social movement building. And it is very, and a lot of times I think people and I'm talking too much now, but there are people on the left even who criticize social movement building as, oh, it's disparate or it's a mess or whatever. But it's really the project. This has been a long-term 40+ year project to reach this particular outcome. And my hope is that we seize this moment and recognize, as Noelle and Jennifer pointed out, that this is our last gasps here at protecting democracy, and stopping the rise of authoritarianism and this fascism that will be absolutely devastating. It's already devastating, but will continue to be.
Well, thank you very much for that. You're absolutely correct, and I'm glad you ended with the fascism. And let me turn to Jennifer, because you emphasized the importance of taking action. And what's interesting about that, and I'm smiling, having just done this myself, having an op-ed in a metropolitan paper over the weekend. Basically, the headline was public higher education has been hijacked. Is that we write, and so we write thought pieces, but this is a time for action. And the next step, I live part year in Florida, with the Stop Woke Act and the all the things that the DeSantis administration, or let me call it the DeSantis regime, has done. And the most recent one featured in Inside Higher Education today, we've had it on the website earlier, is the next step, which is absolutely frightening. And that is DeSantis has had, an attack dog, a conservative attorney who's made public statements that essentially he's making a case for the fact that faculty in the classroom cannot criticize public officials, including the governor. And this is the frightening part. because academic speech is government speech. And so what that does is it privileges government speech and those in government. And then the only option for faculty is to respond. And I was thinking about that as I was rereading Professor Wahab's article in Truth Out. Your thoughts about these continued movements to more and more, as Noel talked about, the authoritarian university or beyond, to really a fascist environment. This last thing, and this may go to the legislature too soon for a vote, and would affect all public higher education in the state of Florida.
Yeah, thank you. So much, so many great thoughts. I mean, so many, the Bethany, and then now this question. So I was on an AAUP podcast recently where I talked about these analytic frames, authoritarianism versus fascism. And I had written a piece for Academe about subnational authoritarianism when the red state legislators started to go to try and abolish DEI and so-called divisive concepts. And I'm a little more comfortable at this point now. And so I used authoritarianism quite a bit, but I also studied China. And China to me fits, and actually I taught a class this term, was fascinating and terrifying. We all sort of had panic attacks on a daily basis, but I taught a class on film and fascism, and we talked about racial fascism in the US and where we are today. But I think of authoritarianism in terms of like Xi Jinping and more technocratic and control regimes that are tapping into although, I mean, there's all kinds of overlap, right? But regimes that are tapping into classic fascist kinds of sensibilities around gender and sexuality and race, and also are trying to develop or have a populist base and a paramilitary and that kind of thing. That to me is now verging into fascism. And I think we're really close to that. And so I'm sort of stopped using authoritarianism and I'm using fascism more often. But I also, the question about Noel asking, so actually, I'm sorry, Frank, your question was covered so many different things, but I'm also thinking about this question of Noel saying, what about civic engagement? And that this is civic engagement for democracy against authoritarianism. And then your question to Bethany about to what extent is the center left being either is it either complying or is it internalizing the far right? It's sort of distinguished. It's not a cynical. It's not just a compliance. It's actually believes some of this. There was an article in was it Chronicle or Inside? Chronicle of Higher Ed by a couple. They both have the last name Story. Who are fellows at the American Enterprise Institute. And it was about, and this is something I've been following in part because I've been invited through this right-wing money to speak at various places as this sort of alternative to someone like Keith Whittington. So University of Utah State University brought me and Keith out to sort of debate neutrality. And I've sort of been looking, UVA brought me out around, and it was also, so then I'm like, where's all this money coming from to bring people out and have buffets and all of this kind of stuff? So I started trying to look into it. And then this article yesterday really exposes all of this Republican politician money. And part of it is also lobbying groups that then put forward proposals for legislators and all of this money. So it's not just the sticks of the censorship and the repression, but it's also the money that's going into trying to bypass the shared governance that, the 1966 shared governance, and the idea is trying to bypass it so that you have centers and institutes that are not being chosen by faculty, have not been decided as a priority for their particular students. And they're being, and it's hiring people who are part of this sort of idea that the university has become too woke, and we're also not, we don't understand our own government and civic engagement. So there's this weird, so if we could take, there's this weird idea of civic engagement that's really tilting very center right and right now. And a lot of right-wing money going into it is a way of kind of what I see as and I've experienced in these settings as a kind of taming or disciplining of students' speech. But if we can actually, again, it's sort of like the word freedom. Like, why does the right get it? Like, we can reclaim civic engagement as democratic engagement and protest and activism as part of that. I think that's a really great strategy. But the article in the Chronicle that I want to just mention, by these two American Enterprise Institute, it's talking about it's normalizing what's happened. So whereas as I'm watching it, I'm thinking this is really interesting, and it's bypassing shared governance, and all of a sudden we have money for things that we've been begging for money forever, and all of a sudden there's all this money and these new hires. We've been going, begging for tenure lines, and so as I've been watching it as a kind of sinister part of these movements towards authoritarianism or fascism, they're normalizing it in this article, and they're saying, look how great it is. And we talked to a bunch of faculty who were hired, and they love the fact that it's revitalizing notion, their fields, they're more traditional fields. The word conservative, I don't think comes up in the article. This is a piece written by the American Enterprise Institute people, but it's sort of like the more traditional or fields of study that have been neglected in the last 5 years. Now people can start to talk about them again in these places, and it's wonderful for these faculty. And it's normalizing it in part because it is saying things like, we have to keep a watch on, make sure that they're as rigorous as the other kinds of departments that are at universities. So there's this language that it's really disturbing, and it's very much part of this normalizing and co-opting of center and center left. And I really do like the idea of part of the, I do think we cannot think our way through this. I think we have to act our way through this through collective action, solidarity, and linked struggles. But if we can make part of that, the narratives around these linked struggles, that protest is civic engagement.
Yeah.
I would like that. I think that's a really great move.
Well, again, I'm glad that where you brought up this what I would call capture. When you think about it, civic engagement being captured for not center right, but farther to the right purposes makes a lot of sense when you think about Chris Rufo and how that crowd thinks. Grab it and make it your own. And that leads me to ask Noelle this. I mean, what you said, and I run up against this all the time with the public. Now that I'm a professor emeritus, I spend more time with the public than with colleagues. The other way, before that, it was very much removed. And this issue of this is an educational moment, and that what's happening now is vital for democracy, as you've said, and those are themes in your Scientific American piece. What's interesting to me, going back to this capture, is, and I certainly see it in Florida, is that people are overlaying, I would say, an alien ahistorical perspective of what a college and university is, what higher education is, so that we can make it into a delivery system for what we what we hope to see. And then related to that is, and I think there is some truth, Jennifer, in that op-ed, in the sense that we're seeing in the work that Ruben and I do that many faculty, since neoliberalism has been around for a long time now, their mindset is very much neoliberal. And so to what extent, if I do this, to what extent will it satisfy, or will it contribute to the ends I seek? But Noelle, the question then is, what frightens me, a lot of things frighten me. What really frightens me is these perspectives on what higher education is that drives, say, opposition to the campus protests, without really understanding the importance of campus protests, not just now, but historically. And we seem to be getting away from, well, what is higher education? What was it founded to do and be? And what should I hope for my son and daughter if they're students in higher education? Your thoughts?
Well, it's an interesting question. One of the first interviews I did was with Chris Cuomo's show. I don't encourage watching it. He's rather unhinged. He was especially unhinged, but he was saying, he was like, as if I was out there destroying the minds of young people with all this kind of rhetoric. It's like, that is just so condescending that I'm out there teaching them or persuading them. These are young people with minds of their own, and they're teaching me a lot. So, yeah, that's a huge battle. I mean, the story, the anti-elitist story about higher education is as old as America, pretty much. And I don't know that we're going to be able to do anything about that. And then now the neoliberal story that, just go in and get a job, let's close down those humanities departments.
Yeah.
That goes on. And so I don't know that this is a very different moment than that. My thing about the authoritarian university is that, and I'm not going to go into that my psychoanalytic work to think about what drives these kinds of anxieties. And usually it's a fear. Usually there's a kind of that people find solace in their group. And then that any attempt to threaten their group becomes this mortal enemy that needs to be destroyed. It becomes this phobic object in the fantasy that it will destroy us. So that the university leadership thought there were outside agitators. I mean, they believed this. And they got very, very defended, using psychoanalytic terms. And the convocation hall where the university administration is housed had been on lockdown for weeks beforehand, and it still is. Visiting families can't get into the library right now. All the buildings are locked. It's this paranoia that leads to all these defenses and narrowing down because they really do think they're being attacked. And then what they do is they bring in the just the way martial law is. It's an emergency situation. We have to just suspend the normal rules. There's all that. And then there's what everyone's talking about diminishing tenure, changing, also closing down public spaces for people to gather, closing down communication. Right now, for the past year, there's no ways for faculty to talk to other faculty across the university or students. They've closed those down. This is the authoritarian playbook about how to keep to diminish the power of the public to threaten their own power. Mm-hmm. So that's what my real worry is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Ruben, the host, gets a chance to weigh in too, and we've got about 15 minutes. Your thoughts, and then we'll have an open conversation here, back and forth.
Thank you, Frank, and thank all of our panelists for their very insightful comments. There are so many dimensions to this. There's not a right-wing movement. There's a right-wing movement writ large with lots of different threads. We've got the political evangelicals. We've got the fascists. We've got the neoliberals. And so on, and probably a lot of other sub-threads that are working through. But we don't have an organized countervailing movement, and that's what we're really talking about. In times of authoritarianism, the dictators go after the intellectuals, they go after the media, and so on. And to some extent, our fellow colleagues simply are not attuned to what's going on. And I'm hoping that the student protests will wake them up and recognize that, in fact, there is a real threat, not just to democracy writ large, but to their own work and to their work lives and to their own personal lives. We really need to keep that in front of them, and for them to recognize that anti-indoctrination is indoctrination, that we are the ones who are not indoctrinating, we're actually promoting open-mindedness and critical thinking and so on. And so what I'd like our panelists today to do is to think a little bit about why the dictators go after the intellectuals, why the media, which is also vulnerable during those times, isn't really standing up for itself. I mean, to me, they seem to be rather complicit, but maybe I'm wrong. So if the three of you can speak to some of these issues, I'd appreciate it. We can start with Bethany and then Jennifer and Noel once again.
Thank you. Yeah, great questions. What comes to mind for me, I don't know that I'm going to directly answer your question, but what in listening and what I've been thinking about a lot lately is that neoliberalism has been about a 40+ year concerted project. And I've thought a lot about how many people now have been so socialized under the norms of neoliberalism. So the competition, or the, in higher education, just the edupreneur you know, everyone, the individualism, the precarity and austerity rhetoric. We've all been socialized under this, and it's very hard to push against it because our rhetoric, our policy, our deans, our presidents are all, they're all speaking this same language, and it's and it's so far afield from public education as a public good. You know, it's really this corporatized, privatized rhetoric, and they now sprinkle things like commitments to racial and equity and social justice, but it's completely misaligned with their neoliberalist goals and policies and practices. And my colleagues, we're all performing, we're all agents now of, and as Jennifer was saying, like this controlled, we're disciplined, we're socialized under this regime. And what I'm thinking so much about is so is our students, young people have all been socialized under this and don't know other ways of organizing society and public life and that civic engagement and action. And so you have these brave, courageous warriors who are coming out so attuned to something different. And these young people are helping even me think about this new imagination of where we could go and how we need to come together and fight back in these new ways. And I'm completely off the question, but this is where I'm thinking about is how we have to promote this new imagination and these new ways of organizing and coming together for this public good. And I'm so thrilled that Jennifer is, you know, that this national action is continuing. And I think hopefully these conversations will inspire, and but we do have to think about how do we re-socialize even our colleagues, you know, the public writ large, to bring them back into or to build something new that is in service to everyone thriving, right? And anyway, I think that that's where my mind is going is what, you know, what is at stake, but how do we need to talk differently about this to inspire social movement building?
Thank you. Right. And, you know, when I give guest lectures on neoliberalism, students sometimes come up and say, I didn't know I held neoliberal beliefs, right? But now we're like in their third generation of people who have been socialized into that type of regime. Jennifer?
Yeah, and I think part of the narrative trying to dehumanize, defame as ignorant, they don't even know that it's the Jordan River, the Mediterranean Sea, like all of that kind of language. Part of it about is in focusing so much on more famous schools, and all of the lower tier, less well-branded schools aren't getting the attention. Part of the effect of that is to try to act like there isn't a shift, that it's just the white liberal or the certain groups that are feeling guilty, and it can all be wrapped up into this anti-DEI narrative. But in fact, there is a shift. As Noelle said, she's learning from her students. As Bethany said, it's incredible to me at Portland State. I mean, these are not wealthy students, and we do have a president who is being extraordinarily defensive, which means repressive, and very much seeing herself as under attack a lot. So this language of being under attack is now all of the administrators are sort of identifying with that and sort of feeling martyred by that, as opposed to sort of standing up to it. So the fact that at Portland State, people are risking not graduating, suspension, expulsion, and they don't have class mobility, they never did. That's huge, and that's a huge shift, and it's different from other. I do feel like I've taught at Portland State since 1999. This generation feels different to me, and it has for like 5 years, and it's pretty damn exciting and hopeful. And Bethany mentioned building something new. one of the sort of sickening ironies of the last few months for me has been that this language of the capture, the ideological capture of liberal institutions, the hijacking of liberal institutions, and that higher education is bankrupt. I've been watching the right-wing trolls push this for 5, 6, 7 years. And what's horrible is what the sickening irony for me right now is that the exposing of higher ed being bankrupt, morally bankrupt, is actually true. Like, I agree from a completely different standpoint now with the very people that I've been following and arguing and terrified of, in the sense that we have exposed with the congressional hearings, with the donors, with the Lawrence Summers tweeting and Claudine Gay getting fired. We have exposed the fact that it isn't this autonomous sector with integrity that is, a sort of fourth or fifth estate like the press that can speak up for democracy and that can be critical. In fact, we are hired and fired by people who themselves are hired and fired by people who are not academics, are not intellectuals. And so the exposing of that, I think, for everybody is starting to happen. And I think that could lead to some real shifts towards building something new. The Board of Trustees, it doesn't make any friggin' sense. Why should Lindsay Burke, or whatever her name is, who does not have the expertise of Bethany and her colleagues, why should she have that degree of power? It doesn't make any sense. So we might be starting to expose those things in order to build something new. The other thing that gives me hope is that I've been for a long time concerned about adjunctification, because without job security, you don't have academic freedom. Without a collective mass of people who have job security, you don't have true shared governance, all of those things. And I think the fact that I was at a conference with Helena Worthen, who does a lot with precarity and HELU, and she said, can we at least, and she's been an adjunct for many, many years, and she said, now that the president of Harvard can be fired, can tenured faculty finally admit that they are also precarious, and that our lives are completely intertwined with our contingent faculty lives? And I think it's not a pretty opening, because it's an ugly opening of exposing a certain kind of bankruptcy of education. And it's also an ugly opening of realizing that we all should be afraid, but it is an opening. I think can be promising.
Thank you. Just recently, I learned there's a new book out, Politics Without Ethics. And of course, we've all felt that that's what we're facing, right? And it's difficult to engage in addressing many of the issues when the other side doesn't care and doesn't abide by any rules and so forth. And unfortunately, we are, and our students are being socialized to be moral members of civic society. So that creates quite a quandary for us. Thank you for your comments. Noelle?
Thank you. This is so rich. Often there's the conflation between civil and civic, about being nice and all that. And I think true civic action can be very hard-nosed and aggressive. And so we need to be careful, because, okay, so here's what I want to closing remarks around would be paying attention to what is going on within our universities, within those other two spheres, the boards of trustees, the governing boards and the presidents. Also mindful that these work differently in the private versus public universities. So I think I'm the only person here from a private university. So it's and sometimes I think, oh, thank God I'm not being told what to do by the state legislature like my colleagues at UGA or Georgia Tech are having to deal with. But I don't really know who is running the show. It's a very, very closed door board of trustees. It's hard to know what they're doing, why they're doing. There's no open records. It's all quiet. I do get the feeling that they talk with their counterparts at other private universities, and there's a lot of kind of language that circulates among them that kind of circulates down. So just as a kind of to flag some of what I'm hearing, one of the things I'm hearing is that we need now to heal. Our faculty seem to be so upset, or some have been hurt, right? Some have been hurt, the ones who feel like that maybe this anti-Semitic language is actually hurting them, or then the ones who have been doing it are not really doing their job well. So we need to kind of keep them in line and try to have sessions to try to heal things. So this is a larger problem. It's a rhetoric of when the oppressor feels like the people who they've oppressed need to apologize and make nice rather than getting any actual justice. So I'm waiting for this to happen in the fall. This session is calling for healing and reconciliation and all of that. So there's, and I'm also, what y'all are saying reminds me of the very first question that around what happens, how things get derailed in the center left is the target. When I mentioned that the students' Cop City protest, one of them, and then there was a chant that was in solidarity with Palestine. Then the whole Cop City thing got then immediately delegitimized as anti-Semitic. So there's ways in which these terms are being deployed to delegitimize movements. That's something I'd love to, I don't know if we have time now, but to think about how language is being used and deployed to delegitimize searches for justice, right? Yeah, I'll stop with that.
And just plain lying.
Mm-hmm.
So we have come to the end of our session, but I want to really thank all of our panelists and Frank for the work that you do with me on this. I would invite Bethany and the rest of you to please share information about the Day of Action and other activities that you know are going to be going on. We want to serve as a medium for conveying a lot of what may be happening out there, all the good things that are happening out there, because certainly we do not want the repressive forces in society to take down the academy. We are the last bastion of democracy, and I think that we have to go all the way to protect it. And so let's get organized and do it. I want to thank each and every one of you for your time. Maybe in the future we can get together and have a more focused conversation about one or two or three of the dimensions that have been raised here, because obviously we didn't have enough time to go into each of them in any great depth, and we need to. So thank you very much, and I invite you to come back again soon. Thank you.